Carl grew up in Cleveland to a religious family that God believed that God could heal no illness. Many of us have been through religious families and can relate to some of what you're talking about. He went from Cleveland to California. And there he attended Stanford University and discovered a whole new experience, a whole new world. He graduated in economics and then studied music at San Jose State. His family was probably not too thrilled about that, but they were happy when he decided to be a banker rather than a musician. But I think the arts percolated up at some point despite that. His career enabled him to live and work in Latin America, Canada, and North Africa. He says he's put his foot in his mouth in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. He also became a U.S. dual citizen with Canada. His debut thriller, Murderabilia, was published in 2009. It won the Left Coast Crime and San Diego Book Awards. So congratulations, Carl. It's awesome. Saving Evan is his second novel and just came out, just recently published in August. He's involved in nonprofit work. He is the president of Partners in Crime, the San Diego chapter of Sisters in Crime, which we all know as an organization of authors and fans. Additionally, he's a partner in San Diego Special Venture Partners. It's an organization that mentors other nonprofits. Carl lives with his wife in San Diego. His two grown sons live close by. And wonder how Dad knows so much about serial killers and banking crimes. So welcome tonight, Carl.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I too am a late bloomer. I guess it was because I repeated kindergarten. So, I was always going to be a little bit behind as I went through. And you all may wonder why I'm so interested in money laundering. And I have not been put in jail yet, so that's good. But I have learned a great deal about it because I use it in my book, Saving Miles. There's a fair amount of money laundering in it. And I had to become an expert at it. So I joined an organization called Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. And I was by far, it's an international organization. They have thousands of members, and I'm probably the only author who was a member of that organization. So I went to some meetings, I took some courses, and people kind of looked at me and said, "Yeah, you're really an author, huh?" So I learned a lot of things there, and plus my banking background. And then I also talked to the FBI with two people there. I talked to the money laundering specialists at the DEA. So all of that, I'm going to try and educate you a little bit on what I've learned. So how do you become a successful money launderer if you don't mind going to prison? Well, let's start with some basics. What is it? It's making funds from illegal activity appear legitimate. It's a very basic, clear definition. But from there, it starts to get more complicated. How big is the problem? Well, it's estimated that 2 to 5% of the world's GDP is laundered money. It's amazingly large. That's $3 to $5 trillion. It's not only drug cartels and mafia folks. It's people, officials, a theft of public funds. It's people hiding their wealth from their spouses and from the tax authorities. It's really huge throughout the world economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And first of all, I want to just find what we're going to do in this presentation. We'll talk about the components of money laundering and the techniques, the entities that people use to keep these money laundering activities secret. What do the banks do to counteract it? What does the government do to counteract it? What do you need to prosecute a money launderer? And the role of cryptocurrency and some of the new techniques that are being used to try and launder money. So let's start with the basics. What is money laundering? There are three phases to it. The first is a placement of funds and that just means getting the dollar currency into the banking system, into the financial system. There's layering, which is moving the money around, typically with different transactions, so that no one could tell where the funds originally came from. And then finally, the third phase is integration, which is recirculating clean funds into legitimate uses. So we'll start with the first one, placement. It's probably the hardest part of money laundering, getting that cash into the financial system, because there are a lot of people working to discover it now. And this, if you may have heard of Smurfs in the 80s and 90s. And these were people that made deposits at different bank branches. Why? Because anything over $10,000, a bank was required to submit what's called a suspicious transaction report to the government. So what did the money launderers do? They had people run from branch to branch to branch to make deposits of $9,000. And you can imagine when they had $300,000 they had to get deposited that day, what a rush and what comic potential there was in Smurfs going from branch to branch. Well, nowadays, the banks have got all kinds of software that spots that immediately. So that's not the way that you can get money into the system. Instead, they use often front companies and charities and what are these companies? They're, restaurants, they're companies that handle a lot of cash. Could be golf resorts, supermarkets, laundromats, car dealers. And the case of Breaking Bad, it was a car wash. So all of these get a lot of cash and they can legitimately be deposited into the banking system. But again, the banks are much smarter than they used to be, and they've got software that tells what are the usual cash receipts for all these businesses, when does it spike, and there's no explanation for it, and then they'll go out and they'll investigate it. So these are all problematic. Launderers also use jewelers, cars, and real estate, where you can hopefully give cash to buy these items. For instance, there was a cartel in the US that shipped drug cash in boxes labeled jewelry, and they sent them to jewelers that they owned. Those jewelers made phantom sales and then declared it as sales receipts and deposited it legally into the banks. Again, the banks are going to check that out, so it's not always easy. Charities, there are charity boxes, all over. People are constantly collecting cash for charity. But if you have to deposit $1 million a week, it's kind of hard to justify that you got $1 million by standing on the street with cash boxes. But it's a way to do small amounts of money laundering, a placement of cash. So there's some more modern techniques that are being used now. One of them is private vaults. And these are vaults and security systems that are owned by individual companies. They're very secretive, and you can put anything in these vaults and take it out gradually. So a money launderer might put a few $1 million into one of these vaults and gradually deplete the cash in it. Another technique is called hawala. And this really pretty much comes from Africa and the Middle East, and it has to do with extended families mostly, where families, know various members in different countries. So someone will give me, or I will give a brother of someone $100,000, and then his sibling in, say, Nigeria will give the equivalent of $100,000 in cash to someone else he's designated in Nigeria. It's been used a lot with terrorist financing, and that's how much of the money came in for 9/11, 2001. Again, it's it's just one of the many mechanisms. An interesting one I found was our IOLTA accounts. And these are accounts that law firms have, and they put retainers in them, settlement proceeds, court award damages. It's all mixed together into a controlled account that pays interest. And one law firm put extra cash from some drug smugglers or some drug dealers into the IOLTA account. Then they made fake invoices from Latin America for services that Latin American companies had supposedly supplied them, and paid the invoices out of the IOLTA accounts. Kind of a creative way to do it. So even lawyers are involved in this stuff. I think one of the most effective ways to place money in the banking system is what's called bulk cash export. And this means that, well, first of all, just to back up a step, the US dollar is a tradable currency. It's a currency that can buy just about anything in underdeveloped countries. It's used all the time in Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, used all over Asia, used in Hong Kong itself. So you don't even need to buy local currency. So what money launderers will do, they'll collect the cash and they'll export it to these other countries where it can be used to buy products, or it can be used to buy more drugs or whatever. The Sinaloa cartel used to put bulk cash in hidden compartments in cars that they bought in the US, and then they'd drive these cars over. They would then distribute the cash to tourist industry companies like hotels, like money exchanges, like resorts and restaurants. They'd mix it in with all that cash, aggregate it, put it in like bales, put it in trucks, drive the trucks to the US border, declare the cash as tourist proceeds, and deposit it legally into US banks. That's the way they did it. There are all kinds of, in Hong Kong and Panama, Paraguay, there's no controls over US dollar exchange in those countries. There are casinos in Hong Kong and other countries as well, where you can buy chips with cash, make a few rounds of betting, and then cash out the chips. And now the cash has been separated. So, and then finally, another way that's often used is debit cards, where the money launderers will incorporate a whole group of people who takes cash to buy debit cards, each at less than $10,000, so there are no reports. They put all the debit cards together. They send the debit cards to another country, put them in ATMs, and gradually take out the cash. Just some of the many ways that people are using money laundering, or using the techniques for money laundering. So once the money is in the banking system, then the disguises keep on going, because what the money launderers want to do is hide the link between that money and its criminal source. So they'll route the money through various transactions. So for instance, they might have $100,000 in the bank. They'll cut it up into $15,000 traveler's checks or to bank drafts. And they will ship all those checks to other people who will then aggregate them together for something else. But the banks now are kind of on to that one, because when someone buys round or does round denominations of traveler's check or of bank drafts, it's kind of a clue they're up to something. Or if they buy sequentially numbered bank drafts, or if they're purchased in multiple locations, the bank tellers are on the lookout for this, and there's software to kind of detect it. So there are other methods that people are using. For instance, here, buying and selling goods. That's age classic of how you mix up where the money came from. there was a Romanian crime group in San Diego that plundered unemployment benefit cards for low-income Californians. This just happened a few weeks ago. Then they made fake cards and used them to buy more than $300,000 of Red Bull and Monster energy drinks. And then they resold the drinks to supermarkets and stores. So now the funds are disconnected to the original source. One of the strangest ones I heard of was a cartel that used their cash to buy potatoes in Idaho. And then they sent the potatoes to Latin America, and they were sold, I presume, to make French fries or something. And that way they moved the money from the banking system in the US to the Latin American country. Charitable donations can be one. A lot can be run through a charity. Even in the Trumps, their foundation, there were a lot of purchases that they're now under, are being studied. So you can give money, for instance, to fake charities overseas. A charity here collects $1 million to feed the hungry in Africa. They send the money to another charity in Africa, but who knows whether that charity really exists and how they spend the money. And most of the time, the U.S. is not going to be auditing a charity overseas unless they really suspect something. Artwork is another one. So people will buy art and trade it among each other. It's very difficult to value unless these are masterpieces. But you sell a piece of art from one person to another. Pretty soon, the source of those funds is really hard to tell. Supposedly, Pablo Escobar had some masterpieces in Colombia that he had bought. So, who can authenticate it? One of the recent ones I heard from other bankers that is being used a lot, one of the methods being used a lot now is in international trade. It's estimated that 7% of US trade is in effect some kind of money laundering. Why? Because shipping containers are rarely inspected. So you buy some goods in the US, you ship them overseas, but nobody inspects what those goods are. 5% of incoming imports are inspected and 2% of outgoing exports. So what does a good money launderer do? Well, he begins to falsify prices, invoice manipulation. So, that's the most common technique. So they're selling, for instance, they'll buy a $1,000 bucket. Maybe they're buying $1,000 buckets from, say, Pakistan. Well, no bucket costs $1,000. So if you buy $100,000 of that, you're basically transferring $100,000 under the guise of a commercial transaction to Pakistan. On the other side, maybe you sell a 15-cent steel ladder to somebody in Mexico. Well, they'll sell that ladder for $100 or maybe $30 or whatever it is. So that's a way that you transfer $30 out. And here are some actual examples of things, of these pricing mechanisms that were used. Like I said, a 15-cent steel ladder, $1,000 plastic bucket, a $50 metal building, $5,000 per carat rough diamond, a $60 broom, and $460,000 used bulldozer. So people will use exports and imports. They will adjust the pricing, and they'll move money around the world. They can also falsify the quantity. Nobody checks whether you send 100,000 tons of grain or whether you send 50,000 tons of grain. They can falsify the quality. For instance, gold has their various levels of quality. You can designate it as one quality when it's quite another. And they also will run goods through through international trading zones, like in Dubai. The goods never touch the U.S. So you buy $100,000 of electronics, you run it through Dubai. Dubai takes it off from the container, puts it on another container, ships it to say Iran. Iran sells the goods for $100,000. Just some of the ways they do that. What are some of the common goods that people use in the international trade? Well, gold is one. It's used a lot. Why? Because it's easily smuggled. Its form can be altered. You can sell it anonymously, and you can easily value it in stores and worldwide. There are different qualities that allow different invoice amounts, according to its purity. And plus, there's a whole tradition of using gold in underground financial systems. For instance, also in China or in India, there's a culture of loving gold and really using gold a lot. So what did a cartel in Uruguay do? They shipped gold-plated lead bars to a cartel-run jewelry store in the U.S. All right, so they were, maybe on paper worth $1 million, but underneath they were just scrap metal under the coating of gold, so they were probably worth $1,000, and that, in effect, allowed the jewelry stores to ship out $1 million of currency. Diamonds are often used as well. Canadian drug dealers used to pay their suppliers with diamonds. A supplier can sell diamonds to a jewelry store and exchange them for cash or expensive watches. They can exchange it for gold. Oil is another one that is used a lot. It's easily valued and sold. It's been used a lot in terrorist financing. Cars and parts, a lot of this in Mexico. You cross the border and there are all kinds of cars from the US for sale there. So I don't know if all this is clear. Do we have any questions so far, Matthew?
No questions on the chat. Any questions?
Okay.
I have one.
Sure.
So Carl, that would suggest that the series Ozark is really pretty old school.
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think they'd ever get away with it, some of the things they did. But you have to simplify it for TV. And the money launderers now are much cleverer, much more clever. Well, let's move on. So integration is when the drug money is reintroduced into the normal economy for normal uses. It can be used by companies, by real estate, and there are different ways to do it, like consulting invoices can be used for art, race. I'll talk a little bit about each of these. Companies. So the cartels, particularly as they go from generation to generation, are getting more involved in legitimate business. So if you look at the Tijuana cartel, this was a family that fought a lot with the Sinaloa cartel, and it was a number of brothers and one sister. Now, all the brothers have either been killed or imprisoned, and only the sister is left. And she happens to be an accountant. So the sister got out of the violence, made agreements with all the other drug smuggling organizations, and she has invested in Mexico, in stores, in pharmacies, in resorts and restaurants, and she's probably earning more in the legitimate side of this business than she did in drug smuggling. So that's what's happening. If you talk, for instance, to people in the Colombian cartel, they revere the Kennedys because the father was a bootlegger and the son was president. So they all want their children to live more normal lives and be revered in society, using drug money, of course. But nevertheless, they want to be legitimate. Real estate is a really big one. And, everyone knows about the Russians who've invested in Florida, New York, and also in the UK. A lot of real estate brought up by them. One estimate is that 30% of luxury property in New York City is unoccupied 10 months of the year. That means that they're all investment properties, or they're all second homes. Often they will purchase real estate through straw buyers. A cartel member will have a friend buy a house or build a house in Florida, and they don't need a contract because the friend will never betray them. Because of that, both Florida and California and some other states have now said that if any particularly commercial real estate or even residential real estate is purchased with at least 25% cash, then the broker has to file a report with the U.S. government. So even jewelers, car salesmen, real estate developers, everyone, if they suspect money laundering, they are required to give a report to the U.S. Treasury Department. Another way of integration is consulting. So you've got $1 million offshore. You want to build a house in North Carolina. So you sell some software, you sell some marketing expertise or something to Latin America, generate an invoice and get paid $1 million and go buy it. Software too, of course. Art, you can sell a piece of art and do it that way. One of the interesting ones I found, there's a whole book written on this, is that one of the members of a Mexican cartel loved racehorses. So they invested in racehorses and horse stock throughout California. The cartels love horse racing. So there you go. Loans, if I have $10 million in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and I want to use some of that money, I want to use $1 million in the US. I don't want to go to a bank and have to submit to all their information requirements. I go to my bank in the Turks and Caicos. I collateralize a loan that they give me with the money I've already got with the bank. The bank makes me a loan, and all I do is pay interest and never repay the loan. Another common way to sort of reintegrate those funds. But as you can imagine, as we go through that, the people that are laundering money need help from professional entities. So they find them, of course, in tax avoidance territories, banks there as well as lawyers. They use trusts, limited liability companies, foundations in those places. And they also can use some places in the US. For instance, Delaware, Montana, and Nevada, they all are very secretive about ownership of foundations, trusts, LLCs, and it's very difficult to get information as to who the ultimate beneficiaries or who the partners are in those entities in those states. The Cook Islands there's billions of dollars run through them, and basically they're just closets with computers because they will not reveal any of who the accounts belong to or who's benefiting from them. You may have heard the name Mark Rich. So he made over $100 million trading oil with Iran, and it was a long time ago, and Bill Clinton ended up pardoning him. But he kept his money in a trust in the Cook Islands with his wife, the beneficiary. He was ultimately convicted and pardoned, but they never got the money. So these mechanisms are really hard to pierce. But the banks now, they want to know what's going on. They want to know who benefits from these entities. They want to know where the money came from. They want to know what the family names are and what the families were involved in. They have extensive databases and networks to do that. So why is that? Well, there was the Bank Secrecy Act in 1970 and the U.S. Patriot Act in 2001 that established a lot of rules for bank confidentiality and what they had to keep track of. It established that banks had to have compliance departments, an anti-money laundering person in charge of that particular sector in the bank. And it required procedures to know customers. For instance, if I'm a banker and I have a customer with a business somewhere in San Diego, I have to go visit that business. I have to see that it really exists. I have to know that there are customers flowing in and out of it. I have to know where the money came from and what the money is going to be used for. For instance, I was a banker and I had the chance to get a huge account from money that originated in Saudi Arabia, but I just couldn't trace where that money came from, who was responsible for it, whether there was any terrorism involved, and I just gave up. It was impossible. If the banks don't keep this information and report it, there's substantial penalties. For instance, Citibank paid millions and millions of dollars for some laundering that went through their subsidiary Banamex in Mexico. HSBC in London paid huge fines. Deutsche Bank in Eastern Europe was laundering money. And not only fines, people can go to prison and the bank can lose its charter. So there are substantial penalties for not reporting. So how do they report? There's something called a suspicious activity report. And when anyone in a bank suspects that money laundering might be happening, they will fill out one of these forms and submit it to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, which is part of the U.S. Treasury. And tellers are particularly trained on this. For instance, there was a training program for tellers to be able to tell when prostitutes were depositing the money that belonged to their pimps, the way these women acted, the way they dressed, the people hanging around in the shadows. So they're supposed to report all of this in a suspicious activity report. But you'd wonder, there's got to be a downfall here. I mean, if you're a customer of a bank and they tell you, well, I'm sorry, but I had to do a suspicious activity report. I mean, what's your relationship going to be like with that bank from there on in? So the U.S. government protected the banks. They made it easier. They said it's against the law to tell your customer that you've submitted a SAR on them. If you do that, you've broken the law. Well, now you've got no penalty for issuing SARs, and you've got a lot of penalties if you miss something. So what do you think the banks do? They submit a lot of SARs to FinCEN. In 2017, I had heard a financial presentation at ACAMS, this anti-money laundering group, that between 2,500 and 3,100 SARs were filed per month in San Diego and the Imperial County. If you factor in non-financial institutions like casinos, it's probably double. In LA, it was probably 20,000. You can imagine what it is in New York. So when you think about it, maybe there's been a SAR given to FinCEN on all of us. I mean, the mountain of data is immense. So what do the government do with all that information? FinCEN collects it all in a giant database. It's accessible to over 10,000 enforcement agencies in the US. And I heard a figure that 95% of cases originate from SARs. I can't believe that. I think what happens is that as soon as a law enforcement agency suspects something, they go to the FinCEN database and they try and find the money trail. And if it's a problem, they usually do. It's a very good system. Even back a few years ago, all you needed was a foreign email, a phone number, an address. You could find stuff in other countries. They could find a lot of stuff in Mexico. So it's a very expansive system. There were SAR teams that will catch money laundering, and they will get together to go after one customer. So there might be a SAR strike team with the FBI, the IRS, the DEA, Department of Homeland Security, some local law enforcement. It could be 10 or 15 people on this team that is using that data to go after a money launderer and other crimes, of course. I can only guess at what they're going to do with artificial intelligence with all this data. I'm sure it's going to be even more extensive than before. Okay, so how do you prosecute money laundering? Money laundering legally is when someone moves or attempts to move a monetary instrument outside the US and knowingly conceals the nature and the source of the funds. So it's knowing concealment. You also have to have at least two individuals involved and that knowingly did this. Now, there are two ways that you can prosecute it. You can do a criminal prosecution, or you can do a civil prosecution. Criminal, you've got to get data to establish it beyond a reasonable doubt, but with a civil seizure, all you have to have is a preponderance of evidence that shows it's more likely than not. So you've got a cartel that has $10 million. You seize the money under a civil seizure, and the cartel has to come to that court to defend themselves to get their money back. Well, that never happens. There are other ways that law enforcement can identify money laundering, like spending versus occupation. Say you get $70,000 a year, but you have a $100,000 car. That doesn't make sense. You have $1 million house. That doesn't make sense. So they will take these inconsistencies to mount a case. Also, overseas travel. Why did you travel to the Bahamas 6 times last year? Those are just some of the ways they prosecute. Let's talk a little bit about cryptocurrency. It's kind of become famous for money laundering, but it's not as easy as you think it is. It employs the dark web a lot. There are over 20,000 cryptocurrencies out there. Here's how it works. In the crypto world, you have a wallet where you keep your cryptocurrencies, and it is never identified to you. Then you trade that currency through an exchanger, and the exchanger, then that currency goes to another wallet, which is never identified. The trades themselves are on what's called the blockchain. And the blockchain means that every trade that happens of crypto is on the chain forever, but it's given a unique identifying number, but it's a number that can never be traced back to either party involved in the transaction. So if you're a launderer, you buy Bitcoin. You can either buy it through machines, you can buy it through a trade with someone else, give them $100,000. You can do it individually, where you meet a person on the street, give them cash, and they sign over their Bitcoins. You then can trade those Bitcoins for another currency, maybe trade it for a third currency. And then that third currency, you cash out into dollars or Deutschmarks or whatever it is. It sounds like a really good system. And you can also purchase things, but less and less through Bitcoin. Not many people are going to sell you a car anymore for Bitcoin. So what do you do when the government is tracking you and they are looking at all your communications? Well, you can communicate with these exchangers through Tor or some other coding language, so the government can't break that code to find out what your instructions are. But here are the problems. There's no real value to these currencies. I mean, they are what they say they are. There's no government backing them. There's no gold backing them. So a currency can be worth $10,000 today and zero tomorrow. For instance, there's a currency called Tether which is supposed to, each unit is supposed to be backed by $1. Sounds good, but who's auditing Tether? Who knows whether they're really doing what they say they're doing? There are a lot of fake trades that can happen. So you buy a new currency, and the people that have started that currency secretly own other companies. They will buy and sell that currency to raise the price. And then when you buy it, they will cash out and it will go back to zero. So there are all kinds of fraud like that going, the pump and dump kinds of schemes. There's no accountability. None of them are audited. Tether's has been saying for years they're going to get audited, and they never have. And then, as I said, there's fraud. There's murky and disreputable ownership. So, for instance, the CEO of Binance, which is the largest exchanger in the world, nobody knows where he lives. His name is Changpeng Zhao, and he maybe has 50 employees dealing with billions of dollars of this stuff. There was another exchanger called Celsius, where the CEO was connected to Israeli money launderers, and the CFO was arrested for fraud in Israel. Tether, which I've been talking about, their CEO used to hawk a product to turn nicotine into vitamins. Get that one. Their CFO was a former plastic surgeon, no finance experience at all. And it's a small circle of people who are making these decisions. Plus, you've got the big exchanges like Binance are under investigation by the SEC and the Justice Department. So as I mentioned before, there's no accountability, no agreements. Tether, they found out that it's supposed to be $1 for one unit of currency, not even close. So that is false information. They falsified statements to get bank accounts because no one's noting them accountable. They were hacked for $71 million of Bitcoin. Who knows where that money is? And when you look at fraud in cryptocurrency, since 2012, $1 of every $4 lost in crypto was due to fraud. So just investing this, if you're a cartel or a criminal organization, are you going to take this kind of risk? Is anyone? Volatility, we talked before, it can be worth a lot of money today and nothing tomorrow. Redemption problems. Binance, at one point, people were trying to get their money out because the currency was plummeting, and they said they had operations problems for weeks. So that's a problem. And then regulators like the SEC, they have a special financial crimes and border crimes task force. They're demanding, or banks are demanding, that these exchangers have know your client rules. So they have to know who their clients are, where they got their money, etc. Plus, because everything is permanently on the blockchain, there's now companies with sophisticated computer software that are beginning to establish patterns, because that unique number is always there. And they're gradually being able to identify who was doing what transactions. And they can present the government is paying these people to find this. They will then subpoena the exchangers and find out and identify who the buyer and seller of the currencies are. So it's not at all as foolproof as people like to make it out to be. Plus, in the end, you still have to deal with the banks, because if you're a crypto company, you need US dollar accounts in order to trade, and as well as to pay your employees. And if you get blackballed, no US bank is going to deal with you. They don't want to deal with you anyway because of all the problems in crypto in the last year. So what that's I see a lot of problems there. So what have the money launderers done to counteract some of these problems? Well, there are a few new products. They do coin mixers, where you buy crypto and they mix 100 transactions into one transaction. They run the transaction through several exchangers, then they put it in a wallet and give people passwords to disaggregate the funds to others. That's something going on. They're using offshore banks like Russian banks who really don't care whether they're blackballed or not, and they have US dollar accounts. They're faking know your client regulations as well. So these are just, it goes on, the battle goes on. And these are the kinds of money laundering techniques that I've been investigating. Some of it's in my book and some of it's not, maybe future books. So do we have questions?
We do have a question from a Zoom attendee, Carl, which is, what is blockchain?
So a blockchain, the blockchain is basically the accounting system for trading cryptocurrencies. So what happens is there are computers all over the world, and every computer will register and identify every trade of cryptocurrency. Okay, and that network is called the blockchain. So if I buy $1,000 of Bitcoin, every computer across the world registers that trade with a unique number that can't identify me. Hope that explains it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, either in the room here or on Zoom?
I have a question. All of these examples, I think, presume that at least one of the parties is in the United States or perhaps Europe or somewhere that banking systems are better regulated. But if you were trying to do money laundering between, let's say, Brazil and Zimbabwe or something, I would think. I'm also thinking about Russian sanctions and money laundering that must be going on with regard to the Ukrainian.
Sure.
Russia. So I guess I'm trying to tease out how much of this is American law and how much of it is international.
Well, all the developed countries have similar money laundering laws, and they work together to ferret out this stuff. But when you look, say, at Brazil sending to Zimbabwe, what happens there? Even the Brazilian. So what happens is U.S. banks deal with Brazilian banks, okay, and the Brazilian banks, their US dollar accounts are housed with US banks. And the US banks tell the Brazilian ones, we won't deal with you unless you have know your client rules and you have anti-money laundering rules. So they would, have to fake it, in order to do money laundering, which they very well could.
How about transactions between bad actors like Russia, China, North Korea?
Yeah. I'm sure they're figuring out ways to fake it under probably pretend international trade transactions, where China will say the export is some other quantity and it's gone to Dubai, and in fact what it is weapons systems, and the Russians will they will route their dollars through companies in Switzerland who control the dollar accounts, and those companies will pay for the fake transaction. There are all kinds of ways to do it.
Speaking of Switzerland, has their notoriously private banking system been more transparent lately?
It has. They apply these rules as well. It's still really hard to find out who owns the secret accounts, and they've resisted that over the years. But they do follow money laundering guidelines, and they do follow know your client rules now, supposedly.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, is it possible, okay, how many people in the chain of money laundering need to know that what they're doing is money laundering? I mean, is there a way that you can innocently participate in this and still get in trouble?
So if there's a chain of people involved in money laundering, can you have some innocent participants in there? Sure.
Yes.
Sure. you're a jewelry store and somebody buys diamonds from you, and they pay you in cash, but they have a cash business, so you think, well, okay, that's why that makes sense. So there's no reason to report it. They have the diamonds and they pass the diamonds on to somebody else in another country who cashes them in. Certainly, if you're a banker, somebody comes to you and he says, I have $10 million. I'm going to start a company here. I made all my money in Europe. And he has a whole fake history when in fact, the money came from drugs. And what he's doing is just running it through you. And here's a story that actually happened to me. I was working for a bank in Montreal, and my boss was this crusty old guy, and he said, I want you to sit in on this meeting. I think you're going to find it really interesting. So the meeting was with a man who was from the Turks and Caicos Islands, and he had two business partners in Montreal. The business partners barely spoke English, and he didn't speak any French. So we met with him, and he first of all, he lays out all these books of pictures of him next to these Arab sheikhs. And this is where his money is coming from, because he's got all these wonderful relationships. Then he's got this resume that is like, he's done all these projects everywhere. Okay. So he says, I want you, the Bank of Montreal, to take my funds, and I'm going to invest it in a project in northern Quebec, somewhere in the boonies where we would never even know about, in a mining project there. And I want you to handle the funds. So, plus then he finds out my boss is really involved with Kiwanis and kids, and he says, oh, this is the reason I want to become wealthy, so I can help kids throughout the world. Right? You're already suspecting this guy, right? And then we began to ask some questions. We'd ask him a question in English and then ask his partners a question in French, the same question, and get different answers. So my boss says, okay, well, the only way we're going any farther in this is that we want to copy your passport, and we're going to subject you to an investigation with Interpol. And he goes kind of offended, and then he turns to me and he says, well, can I talk to you alone? I was the young guy. I was the guy he thought he could manipulate. I said, no. And he tears up his resume. He says, I'm out of the deal. I'm obviously the problem. Why don't you just, deal with my two associates here? And obviously they didn't know. They didn't know anything about anything. And we never saw him again. But, this is the kind of performance that he probably put on with another bank, and maybe somebody believed him.
So for our crime plots, speaking of the innocent victim, a person who owned a cash heavy business like a grocery store or a laundromat or whatever.
Yeah.
Bad people, all the way from street gangs up, could be trying to launder money through the business. And if that innocent party starts getting suspicious or asking too many questions, then things could go south in a big hurry then, right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Or somebody wants you to buy gold on their behalf. And if you don't buy gold, we're going to do this to your family. Or I want you to buy products for me, and I just want you to ship the products. That's all you have to do. Just handle the money. It's nothing problem. Just take the money, buy the products, ship the products. That's it. Well, it's all part of a money laundering scheme, and you don't have any connection to anyone.
This is fascinating. Any last questions? I'm sure when you leave, you'll have more questions.
Just a quick last.
Yeah, Lori.
So, I read a couple books by Vonderau, who had huge capital in Russia, and he is probably the #1 enemy of Vladimir Putin. And he says that Putin, all of the oligarchs and people who own companies like the oil companies and like that, and actually Putin owns half the company.
no one knows how much can pass. I mean, they're still gonna poison people, so nobody's gonna double cross them, but, I guess when you read about money laundering on such a scale, it almost makes a mockery of trying to control and keep it. Anyway, just thought I'd toss out his name, it's,
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a whole industry of private wealth management, which is designed to reduce taxes or to avoid taxes and to be secretive about money. I mean, all the big banks have private wealth managers who are sort of pushing against the law as far as they can. And Putin probably has lawyers all over the place. In Cyprus, that's a big one for the Russians, who are coming up with all kinds of ownership schemes where this LLC is owned by this other LLC, which is owned by a foundation, which is owned by a trust. And so trying to get to the bottom ownership of really who controls everything is impossible.
DJ?
Carl, in the news recently, there's been stories about connection between JP Morgan, some of their executives, and Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, yeah.
Are there any allegations there about money laundering and sex trafficking? Because the news stories are pretty vague about that, but it seems to indicate there's something else gray going on there.
Yeah, I mean, there was someone who was on the board, I think, for MIT that was trying to get money from, and he was using Jeffrey Epstein. JP Morgan, I mean, those people, they had to know what's going on, but they kept themselves ignorant enough to be able to say they were innocent. There was certainly sex trafficking going on, and JP Morgan felt guilty enough that they paid a lot of money. And even I think Nassau is suing them for being involved in sex trafficking. So, I look at this from a perspective of a private banker. Okay. So if I don't make my numbers this year, I'm fired. I got to make my numbers. And here's an easy way to not only make my numbers, but get a huge bonus. And I don't want to ask any more questions than I have to ask, because why put my job in jeopardy? I make my numbers this year, and then, next year, what happens, happens.
The three states that you mentioned that had the most secretive banking laws or whatever happen to be Idaho, Montana, where there's a huge amount of Chinese real estate and agricultural investment, and then Delaware, which I will leave for others to ponder. My question is how far can or will the feds dig in to those states with high levels of secrecy?
Yeah, I know they've tried, and I think they can if they have a real serious criminal case, but I don't really know. And of course, those laws are designed to shield these people, particularly from legal jeopardy. So you run over somebody, they sue you for everything you have, but everything you own is through a trust in Delaware or Montana. Well, they can't pierce that. They can't get to those assets. I mean, those are the prime reasons, I think. Or you don't want your spouse to know how much money you have.
Jadine, did you have something?
Very hurt.
Yeah, Ralph, it's pretty shocking and overwhelming. Any other last questions? Carl?
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff out there, and I've been researching it. If you read my book, I'll give a plug. There are several forms of money laundering involved in that book, and so you'll learn. Even there's a form of money laundering that I haven't mentioned tonight.
Good. We'll look forward to reading it.
It's called Saving Miles, MILES.
Great. All right. Carl, thank you so much for your time tonight. This is absolutely illuminating, fascinating.
Oh, well, good. Well, good. I'm glad it is. I'm glad it is. So now you know enough to be charged and put in prison.